something happening here. But what it is ain't exactly clear.
Yeah, something sure is happening here, and what it is ain't exactly clear. And Retake Our Democracy in this radio show, in our blogs, in our alert system, and in our Zoominar series tries to shed light on what's going on and provide you with some help figuring out, getting motivated to take action, but also figuring out where to take action. Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute radio show that appears on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. And I'm Paul Gibson. I'm the host of Retake Our Democracy. Last week, I interviewed Mary Feldblum, Executive Director of the Health Security for New Mexicans campaign. Mary has been championing that the Health Security Act in one form or another for almost 3 decades. And in 2021, she just may be able to push this across the finish line. We discussed how the COVID pandemic has exposed myriad flaws in our healthcare system and our public health system. We also discussed what the HSA is, that's the Health Security Act, and how it would better provide health security to all New Mexicans. We also briefly discussed the history of the HSA, its evolution, the prospects of passing the bill in the 2021 session, and the horribly flawed financial feasibility study produced by KNG Health Consulting, and among other things. The week prior, we spoke with Laura Ives and Jeff Haas. Laura is the former legal director for the ACLU of New Mexico, and now is a partner at Civil Rights Law, an Albuquerque law firm that is representing Scott Williams, who was shot in the back by Stephen Baca. Jeff Haas is a Santa Fe attorney who represented the family of Fred Hampton, the Black Panther from Chicago who was murdered by the Chicago police in 1969. And Jeff has made a career of representing clients in a wide range of racial and environmental justice matters, including representing those at Standing Rock. We spoke about the June 10th shooting of peaceful protester Scott Williams by vigilante Stephen Baca, and used the police lack of response on that incident as a launching point for discussing the Albuquerque police culture and practice, the degree to which the police union protects the bad cops from being held accountable. And then we range to a broader discussion of how this police system is common throughout the United States. You can listen and watch this interview and other shows by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and hovering over the Actions and Events page in the menu bar. You'll find Retake Conversations, click on that, and bingo, you have all those shows at your fingertips. Today, I'm speaking with Eric Griego, the Executive Director of the Working Families Party of New Mexico, and one of the architects of the transformation of the New Mexico state legislature over the past 4 years. With the Working Families Party, OLE, New Mexico Forward, Indivisibles, statewide, and Retake Our Democracy, we first targeted the Democrats in name only in 2016, Debbie Rodella and Carl Trujillo, and they were ousted from the House in that year. And then we supported a whole range of progressive Democrats elected to the New Mexico House in 2018. In June 2020, this coalition, again led by the Working Families Party, continued its work targeting Senators John Arthur Smith, Mary Kay Papen, Gabe Ramos, Clemente Sanchez, Richard Martinez, and Mark Munoz. Only Munoz survived, with 5 key Senate dinos losing to progressive challengers. Because of this, making the prospects for important legislation making their way to the governor's desk has improved immeasurably for 2021. Retake Our Democracy has already begun working with allies to take advantage of this opportunity, with advocacy beginning now and pressing for groundbreaking legislation. Our top 3 priorities are to ensure that a state public bank, Health Security Act, and huge changes in New Mexico's highly regressive tax and revenue policies are affected in 2021. These are ideas that have been brewing for many years, some for decades, and they're doable now. So let's dig in and talk with Eric about what they've done to put us in this position and what more there is to do. Yeah, I always like to ask our guests to introduce themselves. So can you take a moment to tell us how you got involved in state politics generally and with the Working Families Party more specifically?
Well, it was a series of bad decisions, I think. Kind of like Lemony Snicket's, an unfortunate series of events. No, I grew up in Albuquerque and went off to grad school back east, worked up in Washington. And then I came back home in about 99 and got involved in a congressional campaign because I'd been working mostly on policy, but I got involved in the congressional campaign and then was encouraged to run for city council in Albuquerque here in the neighborhood that I grew up in. And there was a kind of a corporate Democrat incumbent who was super close to the development community. And so I challenged her and that was the beginning of my political career, taking on the establishment corporate wing of the Democratic Party. And that seems to be what I'm doing now. So anyway, I did it as a candidate. I did it as a councilman, went up against some pretty formidable. Most of my work has been trying to hold Democrats to their core values, which is why I respect the work that Retake and other progressives do so much, because, we were supposed to stand for something very different than sometimes the mainstream Democratic Party stands for. So took on that person for mayor, and then I ended up running for state senate against a corporate Democrat, and was in the state senate for a term. And then I ran for Congress in an open seat and came up a little bit short against a kind of a not so formidable opponent. I think her name's Governor Lujan Grisham. So she's been a big political mentor for me. She taught me she's a tough campaigner, and anyway. So then, but I was always a fan of the Working Families Party and progressive groups like Retake and Progressive Democrats of America, people who are really trying to keep us, true to our real core values. And I consider myself an FDR Keynesian Democrat, I like to say. And so now being able to work with Working Families, which really kind of is trying to get us as Democrats, but as a country back to the idea of the common good, which I think is at the core of what my own political ideology is. So now I'm on the other side. I'm helping good candidates, great candidates run, who are progressives, who stand for something, who have spines to really fight for core progressive values. And it's great to be alongside you and some other great activists all around the state who do this work.
So you sort of answered the second question, but not completely. The second question is really, tell us a little bit about, you're the founding executive director of the Working Families Party in New Mexico. And so I'm just wondering, on a national level, how did it come about? I mean, you talked a little, like in terms of time frame too. When was it formed? And a little bit about, I know most of what I know about it is from New York and now from New Mexico, but I'm assuming they have a much broader base than that.
Yeah, so the Working Families Party started out as the New Party. A guy named Dan Cantor, who came out of the labor movement, really, like a lot of us, felt like this two-party dichotomy that we were stuck in the United States really had to change. And so he tried to launch, along with some other activists who were New York-based, but really had kind of national aspirations to launch a new progressive sort of populist working party. It didn't fly, but it ended up morphing into the Working Families Party, which had strong labor backing. And it really took root in New York a little over 20 years ago. It's been 22 years. And one of the reasons why it works so well in New York is they have something called fusion voting, which I know we're going to talk about, where you just don't have to choose the Republican or Democratic box and kind of lump everybody into those two, that part of the spectrum. There's a lot of independent parties who can coalesce and support candidates in any party, right? But what the Working Families Party did is, in states where it didn't have that ability to form an actual party, they became active in recruiting and helping elect good working families, progressive Democrats across the country. We're now in about 20 states, including New Mexico, and we got going in 2016. And we're one of the newer states, but we're also, we're not the newest state. There's several new states, Colorado, and we're just getting going in California and Texas. So, growing pretty consistently, and trying to be not a spoiler party, but really kind of the conscience of the Democratic Party, and working with progressive allies at the national and local level to try to move a working families, multiracial, feminist vision for America at the local level. We work in city council races all the way up to the presidential race. So in the 4 years that we've been around, we've been involved in several legislative races, state races, and we, even in congressional races, we try to be as helpful as we can be. We also push a lot of progressive policy campaigns like paid sick leave, which we could desperately use right now, and things like minimum wage campaigns. We were active in the Public Financing Democracy Dollars campaign here in Albuquerque to try to, get some of the big money out of politics and bring community much more into elections. So we do a lot of policy work as well as campaign work. And like I said, we work with a lot of great allies like Retake and Indivisible and Sierra Club and Planned Parenthood and Olay, big coalition of folks who do this work who we're proud to work with.
So what caused the Working Families Party to expand into New Mexico? I mean, at least my understanding of national politics is that there are probably a number of other more progressive states that might have been looked at before New Mexico, but we're starting to look pretty progressive. What prompted this way?
That's a great question. I think that's a great question. I think it's a couple of things. One is relates to the fact that New Mexico's state constitution and our state Bill of Rights has actually some of the most progressive freedom of association and elections protection in the state constitution. And one of the powerful tools we have is having this fusion voting system where you can cross endorse. So we can, like New York and Connecticut and South Carolina, some other states, Oregon, we can actually endorse a candidate in more than one party. So you can endorse the Democrat who's good progressive Democrat on the Democratic line, but in New York we have our own line, Working Families line, and we can endorse that same person if they abide by our values. That's the power of it. Well, New Mexico, the reason why we're trying to do this now in New Mexico, and I think it's one of the reasons why this was a priority state for the national party, is fusion voting isn't the only way for us to build power and push the Democratic Party to the left, right, to its progressive roots. But if we tried a similar campaign to bring fusion voting to Pennsylvania, and put Pennsylvania as a little more middle of the road, but I think one reason why we're here is that we've got a lot of potential to become a progressive in terms of electorally, being not so two-party, sort of locked. Frankly, because New Mexico was moving in a progressive direction, it was a good way to get into a state that not only was moving in a progressive direction, but also because we're a very diverse state, as you know. And we very much are committed at our core at Working Families to a multiracial kind of populist in the good sense, not in the connotation that unfortunately it's been going recently, but working people's party, right? And that's very much the identity of New Mexico in a lot of ways. Like we're super diverse, and there's a lot of working folks who need to be supported in their efforts to raise the minimum wage. We're a poor state, as you know, and so there's a lot of work to do here. So, and then I just think there were some personal connections to New Mexico. I mean, one of the woman who hired me is a New Mexican, so she really said, we need somebody to kind of get things going in New Mexico, and ultimately I agreed to do it on a part-time basis, and now I'm spending a lot more time than I ever planned on doing it. So not as much time as you spend on Retake, I'm sure, but it's a lot of time, as doing these political campaigns. And
yeah, but look at my salary, dude.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
All right. So I just need to remind our listeners that this is Retake Our Democracy, the radio show on KSFR 101.1 FM, and I'm talking with Eric Griego, the Executive Director of Working Families Party. And most of the nation knows that Working Families Party has had tremendous success in New York. Can you tell us a little bit about that success and if they're ever going to finally count the vote in New York from their primary, like 7 months ago or whatever it was?
Well, it was just a few weeks ago. But we had a good night. So they're sort of our flagship state. They've been around the longest. We have a great brand new state director. So my counterpart in New York, Sochi is her name. We jumped into, New York's a pretty big state in terms of electoral politics. They also have fusion voting now. The Working Families Party is pretty well established, and they've been really incredibly consequential in bringing a progressive voice to New York politics. So, and they play heavy in politics, even though they don't have a line in the primary. They endorse candidates in the primary, usually in the Democratic primary, obviously. But for example, we ran a candidate for governor against Mario Cuomo, or Andrew. I'm sorry, not Mario Cuomo. That's his. Against Andrew Cuomo, because Andrew Cuomo, despite his recent being pretty good on COVID stuff, wasn't that progressive. Progressive.
Not at all, Mr. Frack.
So, yeah, exactly. So, Mr. Corporate Giveaways, Mr. Wall Street, and so we ran, kind of an insurgent campaign against him. But the biggest victories we have in this past cycle in New York were electing people up and down the ballot, including taking out Elliot Engel, who was a long-term kind of establishment corporate Democrat in the Congress, and that was a huge win. And we didn't win them all. Like, we lost. We took on some tough races there and didn't win them, but we had a good night in New York. We just had a really good night taking on this similar machine in New Jersey. And took out in legislative races, took out some powerful folks. In Colorado, last week they had an election. We elected a super progressive DA candidate. So all across the country, including New York, but New York's sort of the most formidable place where we've had the biggest impact, I think. We're recruiting and training and supporting these insurgent progressive candidates who are taking on kind of establishment Democrats, whether or not we have a ballot line. We're trying to recruit, and often they're candidates of color. Often they're candidates who come out of, like, not the traditional political pedigree that you see for the Democratic Party. They're people who come from community, which is part of our ethic. But yeah, so New York, I think they lead the charge and they're doing great, but they're not the only place where we're doing good work. It's happening all around the country. And like I said, we're expanding into California and Texas now to hopefully change some of the local and state politics in those states.
Okay. Yeah, no, and I can't wait to see the results in New York, because a bunch of really good candidates are leading by what looks like huge leads, that are really tight where they could win. And like you said, they're all people of color, they're young, they're LGBTQ. It's just solid looking people. And so, you got to think that you can, and they're all replacing these, 30-year congressional people who are white. It's a difference, it's good stuff. So in the intro to the show, I don't want you to short circuit or shortchange New Mexico, because since you got in the game and we started doing this kind of work, starting in 2016, we've started to have some pretty good success. So can you lay out just what we've done in New Mexico? And, it's not just about get out the vote the last day. You've got a ground game. Well, not anymore. We don't do ground games during COVID, but you've got a campaign going on virtually year round. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we we try to, I mean, our strength has always been canvas and field, talking to voters, because, you know, whether it's the research or best practices in campaign, and we all know this, right? What's most effective if you're a candidate or if you're an organizer is to talk to people at their door or talk to people in public settings where you can really connect with people and you can share, information about candidates and so on. So, and your platform. So, you know, when COVID hit, it was just not really a reasonable, safe thing to do for us to go door to door. So what we've morphed into, starting in this campaign, and we started in about March of this year, is our bread and butter is field, and field in the campaign world is, means talking to people in ways that are very personal and very relational, not impersonal things like television commercials, which, a lot of people think of that's campaigning, right? That's you got to run ads and you got to send mail. Everybody hates getting the campaign mail, but it's also the way that we communicate with voters. So what we had to figure out in the COVID era now that we're maybe in for a while is how do we continue to talk to voters? And in this last election cycle, what we learned and what a lot of people are learning all across the country is you can still connect with voters. You can still develop a relationship with voters that's very personal, in the sense that, you make a connection and it's not just somebody calling and asking for your vote. By you can do that on the phone. So we had, we raised money all year long to have paid canvassers. I mean, volunteers are the lifeblood of campaigns, but as you know, I mean, even a good volunteer doesn't know everything about a candidate and doesn't know everything about a district. So the better you get at this, if you're actually someone who does this, if you're a working mom and you need a part-time position, or if you're a student and you want to really, but you're passionate about it. A lot of our canvassers, what they do is they in their as part of the way that they support themselves is they try to talk to voters and ID voters and talk about candidates we're supporting. And the most important thing we do is, certainly in the era of mail-in ballots, which I think is going to be the new normal, hopefully, is make sure people are walked through that process. So we spent an enormous amount of time this last cycle, our canvassers talking to voters about, first, there's an election coming up. Have you applied for your ballot? Did you fill out your ballot? Have you turned in your ballot? And in that process, you also try to educate them about the candidates we're supporting and why they're important. So we're doing this increasingly all year long. So you're not just getting once a year sort of all this campaign mail and, hey, have you voted yet? But it's really, you're hearing from us either at your door or on phones and on other ways like digital media, texting, and other things all year long. And so when it comes to time for us to ask people to support a candidate, we have at least some relationship with them institutionally. That's an ongoing thing, and we certainly only talking to a small fraction of voters, but that's our goal, is to really develop kind of much more of a deep relationship with voters and helping them make a good decision, but also just making sure more than anything that they participate, right? Because as we all know, a third of the electorate just is kind of checked out, right? They're not participating. And so,
well, and especially when you're talking about these House and Senate race, state House and Senate races, some of them come down to a couple hundred votes. And we recall when Abbas Akil won, it was less than 100 votes. So, the volunteers can be the difference. And so all the folks
absolutely
listening to this, we're going to be leaning on you to get engaged in this effort starting very soon. So I realize that plans are just getting underway and candidates in the general election are being assessed. But can you give us a preview of where Working Families Party and allies may be active in the New Mexico state races?
Yeah, so thanks to a lot of hard work with a lot of our allies, in reproductive rights and the environment, in labor rights, and obviously great allies like Retake and Indivisible and Nasty Women and Taos United, a lot of great activists all around the state. We really made a huge impact in the state Senate in particular. We sent, I know you've talked a lot about this on your show, Paul, like a lot of corporate centrist, whatever you want to call them, Democrats packing. And I think it's going to change the face of the Senate. That's the good news. The good news is that, we have this opportunity to really change the political dynamics up in the legislature. The bad news is we've got a big, pretty difficult general election coming up. So our top priority is to make sure the folks that we helped through these defeat kind of entrenched Democrats in the primary make it past the finish line. So our top priority by far is probably, in my opinion, probably the biggest upset of this primary was taking out the 32-year incumbent, John Arthur Smith, who'd been the longtime kind of corporate centrist, conservative Democrat in southern New Mexico, who controlled all the money, arguably the most powerful person next to the governor, although some would say in a lot of ways when it came to money, more powerful than the governor.
More powerful, yeah.
Yep. Anyway, so we again, along with some great allies, worked really hard to find a great candidate and support her and make sure Naomi Martinez Parra is her name, school teacher, mom, community activist. Nobody thought she had a snowball's chance of beating, the Dr. No, as we affectionately call him, the king of fiscal prudence in the state for 30 years. And it was a taste of how fed up voters were with this idea of kind of entrenched kind of, lack of, and we're learning, we were talking about this before the show started, like just this lack of willingness to invest in the community, the basic social safety net of healthcare and early childhood and education, the things that we as a community need to support each other to survive in normal times, much less in a global pandemic. So she beat him. And now she's got a tough race. So our top race, and I hope everybody will pay attention to this, is Senate District 35 in southern New Mexico, whether or not you live anywhere near there. Naomi Martinez Parra is exactly the kind of candidate who comes out of community, who's committed to democratic values, and who is facing a tough Republican funded, corporate funded, oil and gas funded opponent named Crystal Diamond. That is her name. And she's a Republican operative. She was handpicked for this race. And she's already raised almost $100,000, and she's only been a candidate for, I don't know, a few months, which is amazing. That's a lot of money for a Senate race. So we're going to be spending a lot of time trying to make sure that Naomi gets over the finish line.
And so
there's a number of other
Eric, I got to stop you here. We're almost out of time for the radio show. I want you to give people information about where they can reach you and get more information, and about your event, your Zoom event coming up, and then we'll resume for the podcast. Okay.
So quickly, the easiest way is to our website, obviously, workingfamilies.org. There's a New Mexico State page there. That's how you can sign up for our list to get all of our information. The other way, if you'd like texting, if you prefer that, you can text WFP, the letters WFP, to 738-674, 738-674. And that's the easiest way just to get plugged into all the information going on. We also are having a statewide convening where we're going to sort of tell people about what we're up to. It was scheduled for July 25th, but we're actually thinking of pushing it back. So if you sign up for on our website or on our text, on that text connection, you can find out what the new date will likely be. We decided we wanted to maybe push it back a week or two to get more folks involved, because it's coming up pretty quickly here. So that's the best way to plug in.
Okay, so for all our listeners out there, we're out of time. This is Retake Our Democracy on the radio. And by conversation, you can listen to the extended conversation with Eric Griego and I by going to retakeourdemocracy.org, hovering over the menu at the menu bar by actions and events, and you'll see Retake Conversations. Click there and you can check out all of our conversations. I promise you the next 20 minutes of conversation with Eric will be very illuminating. So we'll be back next week. Thank you very much for listening. By the miracle of podcast, we're back. We have to hesitate and pause for 5 seconds so the studio at KSFR can identify when the radio show ended and when the podcast began. And Eric, you were in the process of telling us about the race with Naomi and Crystal Diamond. Sounds like a bottled water or something. Did you have anything more to add to that? I think you were about to segue into other races.
Yeah, so that's our top race. There's a number of other Senate races, including, we were, working with our allies. We were able to also elect several other insurgent challengers. The other one who's really got a tough race in the general election is Pam Cordova in SD 30, which is in Valencia County and part of Cibola County. She's, again, another educator, career educator, who's running against a pretty potentially formidable Republican opponent. And so she could use your help if you want to help in SD 30. We're going to be involved in that race. That's and then there are the other two challengers who won in the primary. Both of them are, I think in SD 38, which is Carrie Hamblin, who defeated the Senate Pro Tem Mary Kay Papin. I think she's in pretty strong shape. She's a strong candidate. She's raising money, and I think that's a pretty strong Democratic district. So I think she'll be good. She's going to be working hard. Saya Hemphill Correa, who ran in SD 38, which is in the Silver City area and surrounding counties, will likely have a decent challenge. So folks who helped out in that race already, who care about that race, can also help there. Those are all important races. There's also a number of races around the state, but around the Albuquerque area in particular, where we have opportunities to pick up Senate seats. Right now, there's a 26-16 majority in the state Senate, and we have a possibility of taking that up to 27 or 28 if we pick up a couple of swing seats. One of which we're going to be very involved in, is there's a great candidate and WFP member named Harold Pope, who's a really strong progressive candidate.
He's wonderful. Great guy.
Yeah, Senate District 23. Yeah, we know him because he's been active in the community for a long time. He's a veteran, African American, just community leader, very, very strong candidate. And he's running against an arguably moderate Republican, Sandra Rue, who's as Republicans go, is a decent guy, but always votes with this party when push comes to shove. And it's on the west side of Albuquerque, and Harold's got a really good shot. So folks who want to help in that race, I encourage you to check out. I don't have his website at my fingertips, but I'm sure Retake can get the info on the website. And then there's a couple of other open seats that we're hoping to keep. One is Senate District 9, where John Sapien, who was arguably a member of the Corporate Democrat Coalition, retired, and his seat's open, and the woman who won that primary, Brenda McKenna, Native American progressive woman, who that's a swing seat, so the Democrats could lose that seat if we don't really help her. So we're also encouraging people. We're going to be working in that race. So SD 9 in the Sandoval County area, Bernalillo, Algodones, that area, Placitas, and then finally the last race that I think there's a few other Senate races where we've got strong Democratic challengers. We don't have to get into all of this, but there's a number of other races that probably we could encourage folks to get involved in, that we could potentially pick up a seat in the Albuquerque area. Katie Duhig's running. She's a great Democratic candidate. So if you know Katie, you may want to help her across the finish line. And then on the House side, we had a lot of great progressives win in 18, but many of them now have to defend their seats in swing Republican districts. So all the people that we work together on, like Melanie Stansbury and folks like Karen Bash, and who's going to need some help as well.
Day Hockman.
Figueroa, Day Hockman. So we can't rest on our laurels, because any of those folks could, be surprised if we don't step up for them. So lots of great candidates you can help in the House to keep that House in strong progressive hands.
So Retake is about a week away from posting an initial ballot or list of recommended races to get involved in, and we're definitely going to be taking our cues from the Working Families Party and their allies. So look for that on our website and our blog real soon. I know that the emphasis of your work has been election circuit type stuff, but I also know from, especially from the last session, as you kept sitting next to me in hearings, that you're a presence at the Roundhouse when it comes to legislation and policy. So can you tell us a little bit about any bills you, or if not bills, that you're going to be supporting in 2021, things you know, concepts that you'd like to see as bills and see advanced?
Yeah, so we're at our core are really slugging it out for working families, thus the name, right? So there's 3 or 4 we think are transformational bills that if we could get them through the Senate, they've been really stymied in the Senate, would really would be game changers for a lot of families in New Mexico. The most important one is this constitutional amendment that would provide access to more kids, not all kids, but a lot more kids for early childhood from 0 to 5. It's been around 10 years. We've been working on this bill since Working Families, but I've been working on the bill for 10 years along with a lot of allies. And it's been blocked by, frankly, corporate Democrats in the Senate, including John Arthur Smith and Mary Kay Papen. So that's a big one. If we can get that passed in 2021, it'll be on the ballot in 2022 for the next gubernatorial race. And that means that we would have substantially more resources, regardless of what happens with the economy. We'd have a lot more resources, and New Mexico would hopefully finally not be at the bottom of the list of child well-being indicators that we are at. We're 50th again this year. So that's a big one for us. A second one for us is really making sure that everybody who wants to can opt into Medicaid. There was a bill that would have allowed a lot more families who are stuck between really not being poor enough to qualify outright for Medicaid, but not being financially secure enough to afford, regular private health insurance. And there's this sort of this cavern there that people get lost in. And given the times that we're in, people not having healthcare. So just that is one way, among others, to really provide healthcare. So we're going to be hopefully revisiting. There was a fund, a healthcare tax fund that would have helped families who were in that gap. Again, that John Arthur Smith single-handedly killed in his committee. Now that he's gone, we hope that we can get that through the Senate, because we got it through the House. The governor was going to sign it. We just never got it through the Senate. There's a lot, our allies at Voices for Children, where I used to work, does amazing work on tax policy. And one of the things that most of us New Mexicans don't think about is how much our tax policy affects what we can do. And right now, our tax policy favors wealthy corporations, out-of-state corporations, and the wealthiest 3% of New Mexicans. And so we're literally leaving hundreds of millions of dollars on the table that could be used for things like healthcare and health and early childhood. So we're supporting some pretty comprehensive tax reform in the 2021 session that if you want to learn more about, I would encourage you to go to New Mexico Voices for Children website. I know Retake's covered some of this on your site too. And it's not crazy stuff. It's really eliminating some pretty egregious giveaways to corporations and to the wealthiest folks in New Mexico. Capital gains reform. Asking the highest income earners to pay their fair share. And then finally, like you, we care about democracy. Like when you say retake your democracy, like we totally agree with that. And the way we're going to retake that is we're going to make it easier for people to vote. So even though we've got same-day voting now, even though we've got automatic voter registration, there are still some other changes we need to make. And one of the ones that we're really going to be working on is opening up primaries to minor parties like the Working Families Party, so that more people can participate in Democratic primaries. Some people think that if we let independents vote in Democratic primaries, it's going to shift the party to the middle. I'm not sure that's the case, because a lot of voters we talk to, younger voters, disaffected voters, they don't identify with their party. They're pretty progressive folks. Especially in districts that are swing districts. We think that if we got them to play in primaries, that they would actually shift the Democratic Party back to a more progressive direction. So we support open primaries. Hopefully that'll be something we talk about in the 2021 legislative session. There's a ton of other issues that we're going to work on, but those are some of the big ones that we will be putting some time and energy into.
Well, we certainly don't disagree on any of those, but I would add to that the public bank, and in place of the Medicaid, the Health Security Act. You talked about early childhood being 10 years. The Health Security Act has almost been 30 years that they've been bringing it to the legislature. And we just had them on our Zoom in a couple days ago. And they've got 180 organizations as allies signed on to support them. So I've got my fingers crossed on that one. What's interesting is suddenly these things that are transformational are things that are being discussed and things that are being, that have viable chances of becoming law. And, it's like, oh, we almost live in a sane society, how about that? So
That's true.
I know.
And we support the public bank, Paul. Just to be clear, we at the national level, we've worked a lot hard on that. In fact, we helped get that issue on the governor's radar screen in Connecticut, and the governor's supported a public bank. So we support that 100%. So we'll be part of that coalition. We'll be driving it. We'll be supporting it, though.
Okay, great. So the big news for the Working Families Party this week, actually, is that you were approved as a minor party, I believe, meaning you can run candidates, but there's a lot more involved in that. Some of it's involving what's called fusion voting. Can you talk a little bit about that and what that means for Working Families Party and what it means for New Mexico?
Sure. So fusion voting is a historically United States. We've been able to vote for a candidate regardless of party. So historically, in most of the country, you could candidates were essentially coalition candidates. They were supported by the Workers' Party or the Farmers' Party or the Green Party or the Socialist Party, and those votes would be aggregated. And if you got the most votes, you then became the candidate. Over the last 50 to 100 years, increasingly with the consolidation of this two-party dynamic we have in the country, it's been harder and harder for that to happen. We still have fusion voting in about 8 states. New York's the most prominent, where you can run as under multiple parties, and so that people can express themselves in terms of their own values through that party, which is what parties really are, right? They organize sort of a platform of ideas and get people who share those values elected. Well, you may be able to do that with the Democrat, who's also Working Families Party candidate, which is how we do things in Connecticut and New York and the states where we have fusion. So the first step in doing that for us was we had to have minor party status. So we didn't do it just to be a party for the sake of being a party, and we certainly don't want to be a spoiler party. I don't have anything against the Greens, but one of the criticisms has been it's a dangerous game to run a candidate and then peel some votes off of the Democrat, and then we have a terrible Republican elected. That's not how we do things. That's not our theory of change. Instead, what fusion voting allows you to do is push the party in a much more progressive direction back to its core values, right? So that's what we're hoping to do by having minor party status. But that is contingent on us winning a lawsuit that we're about to file, which basically argues that the New Mexico Constitution provides for fusion voting. And so one of our close allies, Senator Jerry Ortiz Pino, who's in the state Senate, who's my state senator and is also the senator for where our office is for Working Families in Albuquerque, is agreed to run as both a Democrat and a Working Families Party member. The county clerk said you can't do that under the current election code. We think the Constitution says you can, so we're going to litigate and see what the Supreme Court ultimately decides. So hopefully Jerry will be on the ballot in November as a fusion candidate, and our hope is that we can bring a lot more people into the process. People who've been checked out, younger voters, voters of color, just disenchanted voters, right, who don't really buy into this two-party dichotomy. The other thing that we're hoping that happens is, now that we have minor party status, as I mentioned, if we can get open primaries and allow minor parties to vote in those primaries without relinquishing their party registration, I think you're going to get a lot more people voting in Democratic primaries, and you're going to get a lot more progressive candidates elected who represent true Democratic values, as opposed to much more sort of middle of the road Democrats. And then finally, fusion voting. Obviously, voting in primaries would be great if we can open up those primaries. The last thing we're hoping that we can do is in races where there's an open seat, where there's only a Republican running, for example, and just nobody's stepping up to challenge them, but that if you worked really hard, we actually could get somebody elected from a different party. Or in the rare case, like we just had in Albuquerque, we had a Democrat who was so-so, not very progressive, here in the South Valley, who got kicked off the ballot, and we had no candidate. If we would have already been in existence, we could have run a Working Families Party candidate in the general election and not had to run against a Democrat, and he or she could have been elected. We weren't a party yet, so we couldn't do that. But that's another case where, in the rare case where you don't have a candidate, and there might be some extreme cases where we just have an absolutely terrible Democrat, where we might be convinced to run a candidate against him. But that's not what we do. Our plan is to work with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party to really elect Democrats who reflect the core values. That used to be the core values of the Democratic Party. FDR Democrats, like I used to say, the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party, as some folks used to call it. So
let me ask you a clarifying question. Let's just say I wanted to register with the Working Families Party now. Would that then remove me from the state central committee for the Democratic Party? Because, part of Retake's strategy has been, and we're already having conversations about, trying to get more people on the state central committee who are progressives. Could we do both, or is that what the courts are going to decide?
So the good news is, again, our reading of the Constitution and is parties get to decide who their members are, right? Like, so the Democratic Party could decide that you could be a Working Families Party member and still be a member of the Democratic Party.
Okay.
This idea that you have to be exclusive to one party. So in our rules, which we had to submit when we were approved for minor party status, we say as long as you support our values and you participated in either one of our conventions, or you've signed our petition, you are a Working Families Party member. So you don't have to relinquish your Democratic Party credentials. In fact, I'm still a Democrat, and so the idea is that you shouldn't force people to say you're just going to be this or you're just going to be that. What's wrong with saying I'm both, right? I support this agenda and I support the Democratic Party agenda. Now, I'm not sure where the Democratic Party is going to come out on that, because they get to decide their own rules, and hopefully as long as more folks like you, yeah. I mean, I have a hunch too. So, but as far as Working Families Party candidate, you can be a member of any party and still be a Working Families Party member. And you can also be a candidate of ours. Jerry Ortiz-Pino is a registered Democrat, but he's also a endorsed nominated candidate of the Working Families Party. And that's why we think it's important to open up the system.
Right. All right. So I know the national election is not your focus, but what do you see in your crystal ball for the 2020 presidential election and maybe for the Senate races? Are we going to take the Senate and get rid of the madman?
Geez. Hope springs eternal. Well, we're all working hard to get there, right? We sure are. Obviously, you and I and a lot of folks who work on the sort of the progressive wing of the party, were deeply disappointed that we couldn't get Bernie Sanders out of the primary. It's not over yet, but obviously it's not likely that that's going to happen. Or even Elizabeth Warren. We endorse Elizabeth Warren, and but either of them would have been we think a much more progressive option. But we are where we are. I think we have an existential threat, and this is perhaps the least competent and the most dangerous president we've ever had. I'm not a historian, but I can't think of a time where we've had a more frightening sort of person at the helm with their finger on the button. So I think even for progressives, they know that this threat goes beyond whether or not whatever you think of Joe Biden, right? So I think, despite what some folks want to say in the party, I think progressives are going to do the right thing. I think the more important conversation is down ticket, right? Because I think everybody knows they have to do the right thing if you care about this country, if you care about civil rights and the environment and just human decency. You're going to vote the right way at the top of the ticket. The question is down ticket. I think we have a great shot of picking up the U.S. Senate. I think the worse things get with COVID, the worse things get with race relations under this president. I think the more people realize that this is a pivot moment in our country's sort of history. And so I think it's going to push people who are on the fence to especially in these really kind of swing districts, where you've had a real kind of middle of the road Republican representing states, certain states, that I think it might push folks over. I'm thinking states like Maine, even Arizona, potentially states like Colorado, where I think we could pick up a Senate seat in Colorado. So I think we got a decent shot of regaining the Senate. I feel pretty good about keeping the state, the Congress, and maybe picking up some seats there. I'm not as convinced as some folks are that we're going to have a blue wave, because I think sadly there's still a lot of people who support the extreme positions of this president, or they're just being frightened given what's going on in the country. This is a real tough time for our country, and so a lot of people are scared, and that's by design. That's their campaign strategy on the other side, and the Trump folks, that's what they want. So I'm optimistic. I'm hoping people will do the right thing, and we are definitely working in congressional races and Senate races all over the country. We're also very active on national policy issues like the Green New Deal, Medicare for All. We work with national allies at Move On, at DFA, at Justice Democrats, at Sunrise Movement. Those are all our allies nationally, and we work closely with them. And then locally, we have a lot of great allies like Retake that we work with at the state and local level to also push our own federal representatives to do the best thing. And we've rallied together to get our Senate and House members to do the right thing, and most of the time they do. But we have to keep our eye on it, right?
Yeah. So I always like to ask my guests the last two questions. The first is that, and I don't think I'm going to get much of an argument from you on this one, is that the systems that created the problems we have, the wealth gap, the destruction of our environment, and the response to COVID, just neoliberalism, all of that. We need a complete change, and not like tweaking around the edges and creating a kind of new normal. What would that look like to you?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's going to be mustering the kind of cooperation, collaboration, and courage that it took for us to overcome the Great Depression. I mean, and I even think this is even a more extreme time, because that was an economic crisis, but this is a social, economic, existential health crisis, right? Like we're at a low that I don't think we've seen potentially ever in our history. I haven't been around that long, but certainly this rivals any crisis we've had in our history as a nation, right? So I think you're absolutely right. There is no, and I think this is the dividing line between, I think, this party fight we're having with the Democratic Party. Do you think we can get there through some sort of compromise, incremental approach, which is what a lot of folks in the party offer? Or do you think, as you just mentioned, like we need a structural, fundamental intervention? I always like to use the analogy of recovery, right? Like at some point we're hitting our bottom as a country, and most people, if you've had any experience with addiction, friends, family, or personally, you know that until someone or a nation hits its bottom, which I think we're pretty close to realizing that we are hitting our bottom, that you've got to fundamentally change the way you do things. And you're absolutely right. The drug for us has been selfish neoliberalism, consumerism, free market, laissez-faire capitalism that's unregulated, every man for himself. And I think we're running that virus to its destructive end, right? And so what a lot of our democratic developed country counterparts have figured out, that if you don't invest in some kind of common good, social safety net, if you don't care about the planet, if you don't have protections for workers, if you don't do the thing that's going to make your society fair and just, then this is, we are now the poster child for what happens when you make a lot of really bad decisions based on profit, based on self-interest, based on American exceptionalism based on this idea that, you know, sort of going it alone, law of the jungle. And I just think that the world is watching us and they're saying, like, I think everyone sort of saw it coming, because, you know, the American experiment is coming to a really, really difficult end. And I really think that's what it is. And I say that as a proud American who's had many, many family members who are veterans and who served in public office. I think if you love this country, you got to be open to changing it, right? Just like if you love somebody who's hitting their bottom, you don't judge them. You say, okay, it's time to do something completely different. And I think that's where we are as a country. I hope that we have the courage to change.
Yeah, I've not heard that analogy about recovery and hitting bottom, but I think it's a great analogy. And it, you know, just like we got to change everything we do and the way we do it. This is no longer acceptable. And we've got, you know, it's interesting too, because in the COVID crisis, people seem to have forgotten about climate crisis. You know, it's like the whole focus is on, like, how the hell do we get out of this mess, because it's so immediate. And meanwhile, there's this other thing that could terminate us big time and permanently, and we've got to pivot to that too. So in all this craziness and this context that has been 2020, are you still optimistic for the future?
I have to be. I think we all have to be, because, you know, if you're like you, I'm a dad, I'm a parent, and, you know,
Did we lose you? Having a hard
we
time
have
with
to,
your words.
no. I just sorry. I just think we have to step up. If you have kids or grandkids, we can't say that we're just throwing in the towel. We're going to watch this thing burn down, right? We have to get in the fight, whether it's racial justice and really having the courage to hold our own public officials accountable, including police, including Democrats, whether it's taking some personal responsibility for how we're consuming, right? Because we all could do better. All of us could do better in that. And then, of course, to not check out politically, right? Because the easy thing would be to say, like, a lot of young people, like, I can't do it. Like, I can't even be bothered because nothing changes. So what we try to do, and I know this is what you're trying to do, is just keep making the case that we've got to stay engaged and we've got to vote and we've got to convince people to not give up, because the stakes are so high. If you care about your community, your country, if you care about your kids and your grandkids, like, you know, we got to do it. It's not going to be fun, but we got to do it. You know, we got to stay in the fight. And so I'm trying to stay hopeful. And I'm hoping my country proves me right, that the faith that I have in the American experiment can really overcome all of the bad decisions we made early on and we've made along the way, that there's hope for anybody, just like recovery, that, you know, anybody can be turned around.
I love that analogy, dude. I love that analogy. So for our listeners who want more information about the Working Families Party and how they can get more, you know, more involved with you, can you give that information one more time, and then we'll say adieu?
Yeah. So thanks for having me. So you can go to our website, workingfamilies.org, and we have a state page on that site. That's our national site, but we have our own page there, workingfamilies.org. And you can also text WFP, the letters WFP, to 738-674. 738-674. That's the easier way to do it. You'll get on our list, and then you can sign up there. It's not to bug you with text, but it's to get you plugged in really easily to our mailing list, and then you can opt out at any time, but at least you'll be informed of what we're up to. And if you want to get more involved, you can. Yeah. So thanks for all your good work, for all the great organizing that Retake's done, and all the partnerships, and really appreciate this show and the great research you do on the WIP's website. I think Retake's been such a crucial partner for us in this fight to make our state much more focused on progressive values and working families values. So thanks for all your work and all of Roxanne's work.
Eric.
Great.
And, we didn't talk about this before, but maybe we'll talk about it via email or a call in a day or so. We're going to try and organize a Zoominar with Working Families Party and maybe Swing Left and somebody else on the election in November, and hoping for that on either August 7th or August 21st. And so we'll just have to work around calendars and stuff to see what availability is there. But thank you very much, Eric. Thank you not just for being on the show, but for being Eric Griego and all you do. Thank you very much.
Likewise. My pleasure, my honor. Keep up the good work.
All right. Got no alternative, right? Bye-bye.
Right.